A royal body does not rot like others, not at first. It festers beneath perfume, putrefies under pearls, and stiffens with ceremony, while the courtiers pretend not to breathe the stench. For Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen, the Phoenix Gloriana, enthroned by divine right Decay, came slowly, exquisitely. She ruled with a lion's mask while her gums bled beneath a powdered smile, and her hair, once gold, came out in tufts onto the pillows. No one dared change. The world remembers her as England's last great monarch, defiant, eternal, wrapped in myth. But behind the drapes her body told another story, one of leaking sores, sleepless nights, and whispers she swore were not her own. If you crave chilling, untold corners of history, like this video, and subscribe for more. She refused her physicians, called them traitors, papists, Spanish moles. One offered a salve for her cankerous throat. She flung it into the fire and accused him of bewitchment. Her ladies-in-waiting knew better than to touch her skin, not because it hurt, though it did, but because she would scream a thin, childlike screech, convinced they were trying to peel her away. The courtiers stopped speaking her name aloud. Instead, they whispered titles. Her Grace. The Presence. That which wakes at dusk. Her chambers were kept lit with more candles than any church altar, and still the cold crept in. The hearth never warmed her any more. She wore 12 layers of velvet even to sleep, though no one could confirm she ever did. Some claimed she stood upright all night, muttering to herself about bells that never rang. They said she never sat upon her throne again. Her throne had become a tomb. One morning, or what passed for morning in that sunless winter, she emerged from her privy chamber in full regalia. Crimson robe, ermine collar, the ruff high enough to hide the trembling under her jaw. But her eyes were wrong. Flat, glassy, like glass baubles painted to resemble living ones. A hush spread through court. She moved slowly as if her flesh were nailed to her bones, smiling with a mouth that leaked dark fluid from its corners. "My lords," she said, and curtsied too deeply. When she rose, blood seeped through the front of her bodice. No one approached. That evening, she insisted on dancing. The music played haltingly, as even the musicians were terrified. She extended her liver-spotted hand to no one spinning alone. Her gown whispered over the stone floor like a funeral procession. At one point she stopped, tilted her head, whispered, "Did you see him?" before vomiting on the hem of her own gown. Her ladies rushed forward, but she waved them back, stumbling away like a puppet whose strings had frayed. The stench never left the chamber. Even after they scrubbed it with rosewater and boiled vinegar, even after they burned cedar chips for days. The smell returned not just rot, but something more intimate, like milk gone sour beneath bandages, like flesh still trying to remember it was once whole. In her mirrorless rooms, time dripped. There were no clocks, only the rhythms of her breath and the scrape of her heels against cold flagstone. She no longer wore shoes, said they bit her. Her feet had cracked open like riverbeds. Some said she bled tiny pearls. Others said it was lice, her flesh hatching them like cursed eggs. At night she prayed to no god. They heard her from the keyhole. "Not for me, not for me, not for me," over and over until it became a hum. A lullaby for no one. A ritual not for salvation but delay. She feared sleep, believed it a rehearsal for death. And so, she paced. Hour after hour. One servant, terrified and trembling, swore he saw her tongue moving, even when she was silent, as though the words had burrowed so deeply they squirmed beneath her teeth. She would not be touched, not by healers, not by clergy, not by time. They say the Privy Council sent letters, veiled requests, that she name a successor to ensure the continuity of peace. She never replied. Instead, she tore the missive into strips, then braided them into her hair with thorns. When a lady asked gently, "Majesty, shall I remove it?" she was dismissed for disloyalty of the eyes. Every wall in her chamber had a tapestry, save one. That one bore only soot marks. The servants were never told what had once hung there, but they guessed. A mirror. The rats grew bold in those weeks. One was found beneath her canopy bed, chewing the corner of a slipper she hadn't worn in months. Another scuttled across the altar cloth as she knelt, but she did not flinch. Some claimed she spoke to it. "Tell him," she whispered. "Tell him it still beats." None dared ask who. Still, the worst came not from vermin or fevers. It came one evening when she summoned her scribe. A letter she rasped. To him, to whom Majesty the scribe asked. She stared, lips trembling. Then, as if remembering something she had buried in her own marrow, she said, "The one I killed. He forgave me in sleep." But she never finished the letter. By morning, her lips were sealed shut by a crust of dried blood, and something darker, not ink, not bile. The apothecary would later call it grave black. She did not speak again for 6 days. When she did, she sang, a child's song, and the line they remember most was this: "If the crown falls, do not catch it, for it cuts." There was a time she had so many voices around her, the orators and poets, the steely barons with venomous smiles, the artists who painted her 50 years younger and still called it true likeness. Once they clustered like bees, drunk on her honeyed flattery. They bowed low and kissed her hand, as though it bled wine, not age. But now the court was quieter. Walsingham had long rotted beneath the stones, his Puritan counsel now only an echo in her skull, when the nights grew long, and her fingers began to tremble. Leicester had died, whispering her name, or so they said, but she no longer spoke his aloud. Instead, she folded his final letter and placed it beneath her pillow each night. The ink had faded. She read it anyway. Burghley aged into glass, all bones and parchment breath, until one day he simply stopped arriving at council. Resting, they told her. But she knew that word. It meant the drawing of curtains, the scent of wax, the slow hammering of nails in unseen rooms. And then there were the others, those who left not by death, but by silence. Some vanished into the countryside under ambiguous favors. Some were sent away to Ireland or France or the sweating colonies only to die in letters that arrived months too late. And a few, the cruelest kind, stopped sending letters altogether. She began to take her meals alone. Not that she ate. Her food went cold before her untouched. The kitchen staff began preparing dishes only for appearance: pheasants, lacquered in gold leaf candied violets, spiced oranges carved into Tudor roses. The Queen would sit before them, staring as if waiting for one of the birds to take flight and speak to her. The courtiers kept their distance. Not out of disrespect, they were careful, almost fanatically so. But her moods had turned to fog, thick shifting, sometimes hiding a cliff's edge. One day she praised a young lady's lute playing and asked for a repeat performance. The next she ordered the same girl confined for suspicious rhythms. They said she had begun to forget faces, then titles, then the order of hours. The sun would rise and she'd call for candles. It would set and she'd ask why the day refused to begin. The concept of yesterday dissolved. She'd mention ambassadors who had long been dead and reprimand absent nobles for events that had not occurred. Summon Drake, she said once, her voice sharp, as it hadn't been in years. He must sail within the week. The Privy Council nodded, bowed. No one reminded her that Sir Francis Drake had been food for worms for over 5 years. She stared at walls as if they listened. And perhaps they did. One servant claimed she heard the Queen confess to them in Latin, in French, in cracked Tudor English. "Do you remember Anjou?" she whispered once to a tapestry of St. George. He would have kissed me. I would have broken then. She began referring to herself in the plural again, not as the royal we, but in the fragmented manner of someone who no longer remembered which part of herself had lived. "We were fire," she said to the window once, watching fog roll in from the Thames. "But now we are just ash that dances when the wind is cruel. No one was sure whether to document these things. The royal scribes, once assigned to observe Her Majesty's speeches and proclamations, now sat idle in outer chambers, playing dice with their eyes downcast. They were told to record nothing not sanctioned by the Lord Chamberlain. Silence became law, and so the theater began. Elizabeth demanded an audience, not just with lords and ladies, but with jesters, long-retired singers she had exiled, and actors who once played Titania for her amusement. They arrived trembling, paid well to pretend. She called it her Court of Echoes. For 3 nights they performed for her in a candle-lit hall. She wore a gown too large, cinched brutally at the waist spine, held rigid with a frame of bone and wire. Her mouth was painted red, not with pigment, but crushed beetles and vinegar, and the scent of rot leaked from her sleeves. They performed comedies. She did not laugh. On the final night, an actor dared to perform a scene from King Lear, modified for decency, an old ruler raging into storm. Midway through the soliloquy, she rose. "Wrong," she rasped. The actor froze. "No king," she said. Walking down the dais, each step painful, her heel breaking and ankle twisting on the final stair. She did not fall. It is not the storm that takes your mind. It is the silence after. And then she clapped. Not applause, a signal. 2 guards dragged the actor away. He was never seen again. The next morning, she ordered the court chapel stripped of all color. "Too gaudy," she murmured. "Too much life." She had the choir robes dyed black and the windows painted over. The priests muttered objections. She hissed. Thereafter she held silent masses. No hymns, no sermons. Just the wheezing organ and her hollow eyes. It was around this time that a rumor crept like rot beneath floorboards. That the Queen was not the same woman. That the real Elizabeth had died, and a body double now wore her skin. That God had cursed her for refusing to marry. That the devil had taken her in exchange for the Armada's winds. The people did not rebel. They simply stopped speaking of her. The courtiers began to meet in smaller chambers, dimly lit and far from the presence. When they toasted England, not the Queen. They studied her face in silence, searching for signs of fracture. And fracture they found. One morning she called for Cecil. "He is not here, Majesty," a lady replied gently. "He is," she said, turning her head toward the empty fireplace. "He has not left. He never left. He burns still. He was all angles and hunger when he arrived." Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, too young to have known her in her fire-bright days, too bold to care. His boots echoed when he walked, not with reverence, but rhythm, like a soldier bored in the chapel. He kissed her ring like a man tasting something sweet, not sacred. She should have sent him away, the moment he smiled, but Elizabeth had grown cold, not in temperament that came later, but in skin. Her blood rarely warmed now. She sat too long by the hearth and still shivered. So when Essex brushed her hand in just heat, surged like revival, a heat she did not trust, a heat she began to crave. He called her my queen, like a dare. The courtiers hated him, of course, but their hatred made her bolder. He lit something cruel in her, the last spark of theater. She paraded him like a prized hound, watched their lips purse and their prayers wither. They said she laughed more when he was near, but her laughter had teeth now. She gave him Rolls favors, trust she no longer had the currency for. He was sent to Ireland, failed returned. She forgave him. He spoke back to her in council, shouted even. Still she forgave him. Or perhaps she didn't. Perhaps she only postponed the moment. What did she see in him? A son, a lover, a reflection of the youth that now hid from her mirrors? Or did she simply believe in some fractured place behind her failing eyes, that he was the only one left unafraid of her? He watched her too closely. That was the beginning. When he leaned in to whisper during court, his breath never quite chilled with fear. When he handed her gloves, his fingers lingered just past what custom allowed. When he knelt, he did not lower his eyes. He watched her watch him, and he smiled. There was a moment, they say, in her private chamber. The candle had guttered. The musicians had left. Only the Queen and Essex remained cloaked in velvet and silence. She asked him, "Would you die for me?" And he replied, "No." She laughed one of those tight, shuddering laughs that ends in stillness. He touched her cheek. "You're not dying," he said. "You're being replaced." The words were a whisper, but she felt them split something in her spine. The next day, she summoned her ladies and had them dress her in a wedding gown from 20 years before. They wept silently as they laced the corset tighter than her ribs could bear. Powder clung to her sweat. The gown tore when she tried to walk. She never wore it again. Essex's visits became stranger. He brought her gifts she could not touch, rosewater perfumes that made her gag mirrors etched with riddles. A ring, he claimed, was once given to Anne Boleyn. "For remembrance," he said. She flinched. Once he brought her a falcon. "Teach it to obey," he said, placing the hooded bird on her arm. It dug into her skin. She bled, but said nothing. When she removed the hood, the falcon didn't blink. It stared at her like a judge. Later that night, she ordered it strangled. The boy became a man too quickly. He wanted command, wanted armies, wanted to walk through doors still reserved for graybeards and ghosts. She refused. He begged. She denied. He threatened. She smiled. "You would rebel?" She asked him once, her voice soft as moth wings. "I would correct what's failing," he answered, and so he did. The Essex rebellion was laughable in size, tragic in consequence. A handful of followers, a half-day's chaos in London. He believed he could rouse the people. He believed they would choose him, but they did not. They closed their shutters. They turned their faces. He was arrested by dusk. She received the news in silence, stared into the hearth. Then very softly she said, "I gave him everything but my breath." She did not visit him in the tower, but she asked again and again whether he had confessed, whether he had repented, whether he had asked for her by name. They say he did. They say that the night before his execution, he held the supposed ring of Anne Boleyn to his lips and whispered, "I send it back." But the ring never reached her. Some say it was intercepted. Others say she saw it and turned away. On the morning of his death, she walked alone in the privy garden. The frost cracked beneath her slippers. A servant followed silent, holding her cloak. She stopped near the sundial. "Will it be fast?" she asked, not turning. "They say the axe is sharp, Majesty." She nodded, then whispered, "Then let him blink before he dies." When they told her it was done, she closed her eyes and breathed in deeply, as if Essex had taken something with him. And now, finally, it returned. That night she tried to pray. The words did not come. Instead, she wandered into her wardrobe, tore down every garment he had ever admired, and burned them in her fireplace. The smoke blackened the walls. The smell remained for days. Then came the twitching. It began in her fingers, then her mouth, a tightening of skin beneath the eye. Her body flinched in rhythms that had no cause, like memories buried in the nerves. She stopped responding to questions. Her food went untouched. She sat by the fire lips, moving silently. Some nights they swore she was mouthing his name, but if you asked her, she would only reply, "The boy. He's still here. He lives in my breath now." And she would exhale, long and slow, as if trying to finally release him. It was not the rebellion that broke her, not the failure of Essex's uprising, nor the treason etched into parchment by trembling scribes. No, what shattered Elizabeth was the sound of the axe. the imagined sound the echo of it repeating in a chamber where no blade had ever struck. The moment steel met bone, that was what cleaved something open in her. They said she did not weep, but the servants disagreed. On the night of his death, her bed was soaked not with blood, but salt, the pillows stained with tears and spit, her nightgown shredded, the window flung open despite the bitter wind, as though she had tried to let something out that would not leave. She did not sleep, whispered one maid. She howled. The queen did not howl. She was the howl, and when the sun rose, it found her seated on the stone floor in her shift arms wrapped around her knees, humming something low. A tune no one recognized, but one that seemed old. Older than court, older than language. A mother's song, perhaps, or a ghost's. She no longer prayed aloud. She mouthed fragments. Deliver, crown. Never knew. She would start one psalm, only to stop halfway through and begin another. Some lines came from scripture, others from Essex's last letters, and some from nowhere words that circled her lips like bees drunk on poison. Let him speak before the second blink, she'd whisper, or hold the blood inside the air. The court grew uneasy. The council convened without her now. They forged her signature, wrote proclamations in her name. She did not contest it. In fact, she stopped opening correspondence altogether. Piles of letters gathered at her feet, unopened like petals at the wrong funeral. She refused to sleep in a bed again. Too much dreaming, she said once. Instead, she lay on a rug before the fire, like an animal. Blankets piled atop her, and still she trembled. They brought her opiates. She spat them back. They brought her wine. She poured it into the hearth. One night she scratched at her own neck until it bled, muttering, "Make it open. Make it let me through." The physician noted the wounds. They scabbed into shapes. One resembled a ring, another a letter R, or perhaps just a smear, but once seen, none could forget it. The queen's face changed, not just with age, though age had long had its way with her, but with stillness. Her expressions calcified. The muscles refused to lift into smile or curl in rage. It was as though the theater mask she'd worn for 50 years had sunk into her flesh. Even blinking slowed. Her ladies took to announcing themselves with bells just so she wouldn't startle. Still she startled. At nothing. A footstep in the corridor, the scrape of a quill, a robin tapping against the window pane. He's come, she'd say. He walks the halls. Once she tore a tapestry from the wall, claiming he was hiding behind it. "Look at the seams!" she shrieked. He stitched himself into the border. They found nothing. But the tapestry was never rehung. The servant spoke of a chill that followed her, not of temperature, but presence, as if grief had grown limbs and walked beside her, a twin made of silence. One chambermaid quit after being tasked with dressing the queen's hair. She has none, the girl had whispered, trembling. She paints it on, with ash. And it was true. She had begun using soot mixed with oil to streak her scalp in the shape of her former curls. It melted down her temples when she sweated. Sometimes she rubbed it across her cheeks as well as if trying to reverse the contours of age. One morning they found her before the chapel door, kneeling. But the door was locked, had been for weeks. No priest had summoned her. No mass had been planned. She pressed her forehead against the wood. "I killed him twice," she murmured. "Once by mercy, once by delay." When asked what she meant, she did not answer. A week later, a boy in the kitchens was caught reciting her mutterings to the other scullions. "She speaks backward," he said. "Her prayers go from Amen to Our Father." The boy was beaten, dismissed, and some say his tongue cut, though no record confirms it. But the words stayed. She did speak backward now, and not just in prayers, her stories of youth inverted. When I was old, she would say, "I rode into battle painted white, and the men wept to see their deaths walking. A lady tried gently to correct her. The lady was never seen again. The musicians were ordered not to play any tune Essex had loved, but Elizabeth often hummed them herself, out of tune, under breath. Once she whispered to a page boy, "He still sings." "Can't you hear him?" The boy had heard nothing. But he fled the court that night. Her eyes betrayed nothing now. They had gone opaque, not blind, not sightless, but sealed, as if they were windows painted over from the inside. The Spanish ambassador, upon being granted rare audience, wrote she has the look of one who has survived her own grave. The tomb forgot to close. In the council chambers, plans accelerated. If the Queen was mad, and she was then, the country must not be. Succession, secrecy, quiet strength. The whispers grew bolder. "Prepare James. Seal the route. Keep the death until we are ready." Elizabeth sensed it. Of course she did. And so she began to speak to her shadow, called it my twin, and once the only one who stayed. When asked what she said to it, she replied, "He remembers the words I forgot to finish," and then she smiled, wide-cracked and entirely joyless, as though the punchline had finally arrived. They found the first mirror shattered. Not cracked, shattered. Its shards scattered like bone beneath the Queen's feet, the wooden frame splintered by something stronger than age. No one had heard the impact. No one had seen her do it. But the blood on her hands was hers. She claimed it had lied. She had looked into it and seen someone else, someone without a crown. No pearls, no ruff. A face like hers, but stripped of the titles, the years, the theater. It had looked back without blinking, had not spoken, had not needed to. "It mocked me," she said. "It showed me naked." The order was issued quietly. All mirrors removed from court. All polished metal banned. Even the silver trays were dulled with soot, and the windows curtained tight to prevent the glass from catching her shape in passing. Her ladies of the bedchamber were instructed to apply cosmetics by touch, not sight. Rouge was smeared blindly. Powder clung in clumps to her cheekbones and jaw. Her face became a terrain of denial. She looked like a portrait erased and redrawn by trembling hands. One lady new to service made the mistake of polishing a candlestick too brightly. The Queen glimpsed her own reflection for an instant and screamed. They said it was a sound not meant for mortal throats, like the shattering of stained glass. She tore the candlestick from the girl's hands and hurled it into the fire. The girl was whipped. The Queen later called for her and wept into her lap. "I am not a ghost," she whispered. "Why do they say I'm fading?" But she was. Fading not in color or outline. No, her presence was still a blade in the room, but in certainty, in form. People began to forget how tall she truly was, how green her eyes had been. Her scent became inconsistent rosewater one day, mildew the next. Her voice drifted into corridors before her body entered. At times she was remembered before she arrived and forgotten while still speaking. And still one mirror remained. No one knew how it escaped the purge. It was tucked in a disused chamber near the old library, its silvered face warped by time and damp. The frame bore Tudor roses carved in miniature, worn smooth by years of fingers tracing them in thought. No one went near it, not since the night the Queen found it. She did not scream this time. She simply stared. She returned the next night. And the next. Each time she dismissed her guards and went alone. Once a page boy followed. He peeked through the cracked door. He said the Queen stood before the mirror in silence for nearly an hour, unmoving, as though trying to see through it. As though waiting for something to move first. She blinked, he whispered, but the mirror didn't. When asked what he meant, he only shook his head and said, "She's not the one inside." He vanished before morning. Others tried to remove the mirror. It was bolted to the wall impossibly so. 4 strong men could not pry it free. The glass would not crack, even under hammer. One of the blacksmiths collapsed after the 3rd blow, blood seeping from his ears. Let it stay. The Queen ordered calm and cold. It has something to teach me. From that night on, she changed. Not better. Not worse. Just changed. She stopped speaking of Essex, stopped humming his tunes. She no longer prayed, nor muttered, nor laughed. Her speech slowed to a crawl. Her sleep, what little remained, was taken on the stone floor beside the mirror's chamber. She claimed it was warm there, said it breathed with her. The courtiers began to speak of possession. They noticed her voice was lower now, not in pitch, but in tension, like something being pulled upward from beneath the earth. Her eyes no longer followed movement. She stared beyond people, through them. Sometimes they moved past her and felt a chill rise in their chest, as though someone had stepped through them on their way to somewhere worse. Portraiture ceased. Artists refused to paint her. One was summoned and returned raving. She moves, but casts no light. I cannot paint what has no anchor. He gouged his eyes within a fortnight. She began speaking in riddles. The real queen is on the other side, she said once during a meal she did not touch. Another time, we only see crowns because we've forgotten what heads look like. The Privy Council begged her to rest. She refused. I am resting, she said, more than ever. But they noticed her hands trembled now, constantly, except when she touched the frame of the mirror. Then she was still a stillness so unnatural it made the candles flicker. One night, thunder cracked across the palace. A storm pounded the walls with sleet and wind. Servants ran to secure windows. Lightning struck the old elm outside the Queen's chamber, splintering it. A terrible scream echoed through the corridor, not pain, but triumph. A scream like laughter. She had stayed by the mirror through it all. The next morning, they found her there, seated, smiling faintly, one hand pressed to the glass. Her fingers were blackened, frost-bitten. She did not seem to notice. Did he come? A chamberlain asked gently. She blinked. Slow. He's always here now, she whispered. He just needed to find the way in. Later that week, the mirror's surface was seen to ripple, not by many, just one. A maid claimed she saw movement beneath the glass. Not the Queen, but something wearing her face in reverse. It did not smile. It did not blink. It only watched. When the Queen next entered court, the nobles recoiled. Something was wrong. She wore no makeup, no ruff. Her hair was unpainted, her eyes lined with darkness, not drawn, but grown. Her skin had taken on a hue of bruised parchment, and when she walked, her shadow did not follow it led. And though she opened her mouth to speak, the courtiers swore they heard nothing, only the faintest scrape, like nails on the other side of glass. They had once called her a goddess in flesh. A crown of gold 18 arches of Tudor defiance had graced her head at the tilt of empire. She had worn it like bone, like second skin. It gleamed beneath coronation sun, its weight a sign not of burden, but of heaven's design. But now the crown had sunk into her, literally. Not metaphor, not myth, bone deep. Her skull, paper-thin and treacherous with age, had begun to fuse with the circlet she would not remove. It sat askew, laced into her thinning scalp by old blood and melted wax from the candles she clung to nightly. When one court physician begged to ease it from her head, she screamed a sound that shattered the blue and white Delft tiles of her chamber floor. "You will not unmake me," she hissed, pupils wide with some old terror. "You think I am beneath it? I am not. I am what the crown remembers." She bled from the temples now, daily. The velvet head wrap soaked through with a slow, persistent weep. The maids used rose petals to blot the wounds, not for healing, but to mask the iron stench. Still her hair reeked of suppuration and damp wool. The rats grew bold again. One was found curled in her discarded bed linens, dead, its nose blackened, as if poisoned by proximity to power. She would not sit on her throne any more. Not because she refused, because she could not. Her spine no longer bent the way it once did. The corsets, the ruffs, the years of divine posture had calcified her. When she tried to kneel before the chapel altar, something in her back cracked, and she did not rise for hours. They tried to help her. She bit one of them. The crown was too heavy, but no one dared lift it. So, they pretended. At court appearances rare now and brief, they placed a lighter replica upon a crimson pillow. The queen ignored it. She would wander past, eyes hollow, the real crown pulsing on her skull like a tumor gilded in divine metal. The courtiers bowed anyway. What else could they do? At night she called for it, even if it had never left her. "Where is my name?" she asked the dark. "Where is the weight that knows me?" They began hearing metal, scrapes in the wall, the clink of chain with no bearer. In the great gallery, paintings began falling, not torn, rejected. The queen's portraits first, then her father's. Even the great Armada canvas, once triumphant, now found face down in dust. One morning, she summoned her wardrobe mistress and demanded a crown-shaped veil. "To cover what bleeds, not what dies," she whispered. "I will not be buried bare." The veil was made of spider silk and horsehair, black with threads of ash gray sewn in patterns of serpents and roses. It draped over the crown, like mourning over memory. It turned her into something between statue and corpse. Still the blood came through. Still no one touched it. One evening, during a storm that flooded the lower halls, she emerged barefoot-soaked veil plastered to her cheeks. The crown glittered with rain or sweat or something else. Her eyes were wide and dilated, her lips cracked. She addressed no one and everyone. "Do you see how it glows?" she asked the silence. "Do you see how it sings to bone?" No one replied. She laughed, or tried to. It came out as a rattle. Days passed without sighting her. Then weeks. Some claimed she had gone underground, not metaphorically, but physically descending into the hidden chambers beneath Richmond Palace, seeking older crowns, relics of the earth. Others whispered of a second self forged in mirror glass who had taken her place. In truth, she lay on the floor of her private oratory, not dead, not praying, just laid down. The crown had slumped forward, pressing a furrow into her forehead that would not fade. Her breath came in shallow clicks. Her lips trembled as though speaking some vow that could not leave the mouth. They dared not move her. Even Cecil, ancient and bent, stood at the door and turned away. "She waits," he said, "to no one, but not for us." Food was brought and removed untouched. The fire was stoked by trembling hands. Sometimes she growled when they approached. Sometimes she wept. Once, only once, she reached out not to the crown, but to the hem of her own robe, and muttered, "Too much cloth, not enough skin." And then she pulled at her own dress until it ripped. By the third week she had stopped blinking. The physician wrote it down. Eyes fixed, dehydration suspected, skin flaking at scalp. But he dared not record what she whispered next. Let it sink. Let it reach marrow. They tried one last time. A circle of her most trusted, the Bishop of London, 2 privy councillors, and a surgeon with hands like whispers. They entered her chamber cloaked in prayer and resolve. "Majesty," the bishop began. Her lips twitched. "We seek to ease the burden. The crown." She raised a hand, not in protest, not in command, just raised. And then she said, "If you remove it, I will vanish." The surgeon stepped forward anyway. He reached slowly, reverently toward the gold crusted at her brow, and her skin split open. Not metaphor. A fissure bloomed across her scalp like a wound remembering something ancient. The crown did not fall. It clung. Blood soaked her face. She did not scream. She did not move. She simply looked into the surgeon's eyes. And he broke, collapsed, crawled backward, hands clawing at his own face. He was never whole again. They never tried again. From then on, the Queen was left alone. They dimmed the lights, sealed the doors. The crown remained rusting now at the base, its gold flaking like skin from an aging god. And every so often, when a new servant passed by, they swore they heard a whisper, "I am still here. I am still it." They had rehearsed her death for years. Not the rites, not the rituals, the silence, the manner of it. How not to cry, how not to look too relieved, how to fold grief into protocol like parchment into flame. Courtiers practiced their pauses, rehearsed how slowly to bow their heads, how wet the eyes must be, to look sincere, but not jubilant. For when the Queen died, it would be the loosening of an empire's clenched jaw. But when she finally did die, no one saw it happen. She had not spoken in days. They had stopped checking her pulse. Her skin was cold long before her breath ceased. It was said the fire in her chamber dimmed of its own accord, that the frost on the window pane melted in the shape of a crown, then froze again in silence. She remained seated, slumped forward in the high-backed chair she refused to leave, eyes open, lips parted, crown still fusing into the split and scabbing scalp beneath her veil. When the maid finally approached barefoot, shaking, crossing herself with each step, she knew before she touched her. The Queen did not twitch. The breath did not fog the silver hand mirror held before her lips. The skin waxen and drawn bore the sheen of a doll abandoned in dust. Still the maid said nothing. She left the room, locked the door. And the court carried on as if the monarch still breathed. No bells rang, no decrees were issued. For 3 days England's Queen sat dead in her chamber, while below the gears of monarchy turned without her swiftly, greedily. Letters were dispatched to James of Scotland, seals broken, papers forged, plans unwound like parchment from a wound. Her body remained undisturbed. The stench began, slowly masked at first by cedar and juniper incense burned day and night. But perfume cannot hold back truth forever. The hem of her gown grew dark. The rats returned to the corners, sniffing. The blood at her scalp turned black, then green. Still no one touched her. Not yet. One brave page, drunk or possessed, dared peer through the keyhole on the second night. He saw her still seated, but her head had tilted slightly. He swore her mouth had changed, that it curled into a smile not her own, that something behind her eyes flickered like candlelight seen through a veil of meat. He wept when he was pulled away. Was found days later in the Thames, face pale as wax mouth filled with rose petals. By the 4th day, the silence became unbearable. The Privy Council convened behind shuttered doors. They debated the corpse, how to remove it, who would lie, who would sign. One suggested burning the entire room. Another suggested embalming her in situ and walling her up. A third simply wept and begged forgiveness. In the end, they chose erasure. The physician who pronounced her death, a young man trembling in the early hour, was not permitted to write it. No record bears his name. His diary, later found, contained one phrase, repeated across pages she knew. She waited. She did not die. She withdrew. When they finally opened the door, they found her as before. Almost. Her body had slumped lower in the chair. Her hand had fallen to the floor. Her fingers, long and discolored, curled toward something no longer there. The crown had shifted, or perhaps grown heavier, and tilted across her brow like a halo gone sour. Her eyes were closed now. No one could say when that happened. She was not buried with ceremony. Not truly. They staged a performance weeks later, dressed a wax replica in regalia, paraded it through London as organ bells groaned and nobles wailed behind handkerchiefs. The people wept. Not for her, perhaps, but for the idea of her. The wax queen did not rot. It did not twitch. It posed nicely for painters. But the real Elizabeth was buried at night, in a wooden casket sealed in haste. No grand procession. No velvet-lined tomb. The crown was removed only once her scalp had caved beneath it, and even then with tongs. The man who did it was paid handsomely, and never spoke again. There is no confirmed grave. A marker stands in Westminster Abbey, yes, Elizabeth Regina, carved in marble, flanked by angels and crowned lions. But beneath it lies empty air. The whispers say she was buried in a pauper's pit, or perhaps beneath the palace itself, or perhaps not buried at all. Some claimed her corpse was consumed in secret, burned to ash, to hide what it had become. Others said the mirror was buried with her, or that it remains, still hanging in the room they never reopened, still watching. They say sometimes you can hear her footsteps in the upper galleries, soft, measured, not dragging walking, and on certain nights when the moon hits the chapel window, just so a pale figure can be seen, veiled, crowned, bloodless, staring at the pews from the shadows. A priest once saw her there. He fell to his knees and whispered, "Your Majesty." The figure did not reply, but a voice echoed from behind him, "Not any more." And when he turned, the chapel was empty. They built her legacy from smoke and sunlight, not from flesh, not from breath, and certainly not from the corpse that had once ruled them, brittle-veined with rot lips, cracked from a century's worth of silence. The Elizabeth they remember wasn't the one who died. That one was forgotten before the worms even touched her. History had its sculptors. They went to work quickly. The scribes straightened her back, lifted her chin, repainted her eyes to gleam not with fear, but with sovereign fire. Her madness was excised, called poetic melancholy. Her silence reframed as regal dignity. Her filth scrubbed from the margins. In portraits her skin glowed. Her mouth smiled. Her crown, the same that had fused to her skull, now floated gently above her head, untarnished by blood or bone. She was perfection, or rather the lie of it. No one spoke of the prayers she mumbled backward, or the mirror she whispered to, or the boy whose name she mouthed in her sleep. No one wrote about the silence after her death, the council's delay, the week her body blackened in candlelight. That Elizabeth was sealed in a coffin no one could find, but the wax survived. It sat in Westminster bathed in incense and reverence hands frozen in mock blessing. Children stared up at it and asked, "Was she kind?" And their tutors would answer with something just shy of true, something shaped like memory, but hollow as a bell, long since cracked. They printed her face on coins. Her eyes never blinked. They gave her a tomb. Her name carved beside her sisters, though their bones never touched. One burned for faith. The other burned from within. The flames of isolation of power hoarded too long of desire, choked by its own silk gloves. But the tomb was clean, polished, bleached of contradiction. There is no place to lay flowers for the woman who died. Only for the monarch who never did. The archives still carry her decrees, her victories, her speeches, though many were rewritten, restructured, refined for ears, less frightened of what a woman might become if she outlived everyone she loved. She became a symbol, and in that transformation, she was erased. Elizabeth, the breathing woman who paced her chamber barefoot, who bled into her ruffs, who heard voices behind walls and begged her mirror for silence, she became dangerous to remember. Too human, too mortal. And so the state killed her twice, once in flesh, once in memory. The second death took longer. It began with silence in the records, Then came the portraits, each more luminous than the last, until her veins were forgotten entirely. Then the books, each biography, smoothing her into a pillar. Virgin Queen. Glorious. Eternal. Eternal things do not scream in the dark. They do not pray with cracked lips and forget the words halfway through. They do not die, sitting up, crown fused to bone eyes open. But she did. And so she became legend, the only cage history allows its queens. Now centuries on, she watches us from coins, from school books, from the stained glass of Anglican chapels. She smiles a little. Her head tilts just enough. She wears power like perfume, scentless, timeless. But she is not there. No bones beneath the abbey stone. No breath in the halls. Only echoes. And sometimes if you walk the corridors of Richmond Palace, ruins just before dawn, when the mist lifts and the air freezes in your throat, you might hear a rustle of silk, a cough, dry and ragged. A voice cracked royal and wrong whispering. Do I still reign? There is no answer. But the question is the truth. That is her legacy, not the myth, not the crown, not even the empire she left behind. It is the silence she taught them to rehearse. It is the terror of being forgotten. It is the mirror left hanging even now in a chamber no one dares to open. And on its silver face, untouched by dust, a face still lingers, veiled half-turned eyes closed, waiting. Not for history, not for forgiveness, but for anyone who dares to say her name as it truly was. Not Gloriana. Not Majesty, just Elizabeth, just the woman who lived too long and was buried far too clean.